Hello, and welcome to Monster Mechanics, where we dissect creatures of myth and media to see how they can be improved. I am your host, Scott Paladin, and with me as always is the Millie to my Vanilli, Zach Jaquays. Zach, what's today's episode?
Today we are talking about mermaids.
Mermaids, great. So, if anybody listening to us doesn't know what a mermaid is, they are a kind of a half folk, half mythical creature, and then has been used in a ton of media, where the upper half is a person and the lower half is a fish. Specifically, a mermaid is the female of that species, or many species. And so I think the commonly accepted idea for both is merfolk.
Yes.
So we might try to use that. We might be using that term more. It's interesting. They're a old enough legend that they don't have sort of a canonical origin. They're a folk legend. So lots and lots of guys would have just been out looking at the ocean while they waited for their ship to get where they were going and then see things and go, oh, I wonder if that's a lady.
Spoiler, it is not a lady.
There are lots of guesses and theories about what the exact origin of mermaids might be. Lots of people say that it comes from like certain types of dolphin or whale or dugong, sort of sea mammals that a particularly bored or maybe nearsighted sailor might look at and go, that looks kind of like a woman. I think it probably much more specifically pulls from the imagination of a lonely man.
I think that's probably more accurate.
Yeah, I don't think anybody ever saw anything that actually looked like that.
After you spend a couple months at sea, you start seeing them everywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so there's actually, and because of the fact that there's no sort of initial version of a mermaid, they can be kind of weird. For a long time, no one could decide if mermaids had one tail or two tails. You will see lots of depictions of them where instead of it being like down to the hips and then fishtail down to that, it is down to the tops of their thighs and then fishtails down from their thighs where they have two of them.
Oh.
I think that must be somebody early on going, hey, how do you have like relations with something that doesn't have a, lady parts? And then somebody else going, well, no, they've got like, it bifurcates and then you got to, so I guess Rule 34 is prehistoric in that sense.
Of course.
So, in fact, if you look at the
So it was two fishes.
Yes, it's a woman and two fishes. In fact, if you look at the Starbucks logo, you can see that in the original versions of it, where it's zoomed out slightly more, you can see that she's holding two different fish tails coming up on either side, and that's because it is the two-tailed version of that mermaid.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I was not aware of that.
I think because there's no canon here, we can just run hog wild if we want.
Sure.
And if you want to use merfolk in your stories, I think it makes a lot of sense to decide upon an origin. If you want to use them in a RPG setting or in a book or any other idea, figuring out why mermaids exist in this world is probably the starting point that I come from as a slightly scientific person. I'm not going to claim to be a scientist, but I have that bent. So my thought is, did mermaids evolve from some separate species that then just kind of happens to end up looking like humans? So this is something that started in the ocean, came from fish, like a vertebrate fish, and then co-evolved into a sort of hominid form? Or do we start with a hominid, like a Australopithecine or other kind of monkey man, that got more and more aquatic and followed the same route that dolphins and whales did to become a solely aquatic species?
Well, I kind of like the idea of the aquatic species evolving to look a little more human-like. From that angle, you kind of get things like anglerfish, things that evolve mimicry or defense mechanisms to lure in their prey.
Yeah, you get to pull very weird fish in at that point, and they can be, because like if you go down below a certain depth in the ocean, things stop being recognizable. They start being like monsters, basically. So if you want a monstrous merfolk that probably nobody's going to want to then definitely pulling in something that is much more fish-like and much more alien.
Well, in a lot of mythology, the merfolk are a predator species of sorts.
Okay.
They lure sailors to their doom either with, their song or, pull them under the water and drown them, that kind of thing.
Fun fact, that legend is conflating the siren with the mermaid.
Oh.
And that is like somebody taking two separate legends and shoving them together. In the original versions of, like, I believe it's the Odyssey that the sirens appear in, what they look like isn't mentioned at all. They're just thought to be kind of like women hanging around, I guess. Yeah. I do like the idea of them. I mean, a merfolk kind of have to be a predator species. They're not likely to be, I mean, they might be omnivorous, but they definitely aren't going to be grazers. We can talk about sapient grazers in the
You
future.
don't think they just like plow through fields of plankton and
Uh, let's circle back around because that's actually a brilliant idea of like the blue whale version of mermaids. Let's put a pin in that and come back.
sure.
Okay, so if we're talking about creatures that were fish in the past and have since become much more human-like, maybe, and we don't have to strictly adhere to evolutionary theory here. So, yeah, jazzing off the idea of them being predatory is cool. So you can imagine starting with something like a shark or a sailfish or something like that. Where do you think that would go with what you would end up with? What would that pull from those species?
So obviously you're going to want like the powerful tail and whatnot would be the main thing you'd pull from that species. But if you get like mermaids with like those jaws that just kind of unhinge wide.
Yeah. A certain species of eel have the jaw you're talking about.
Oh yeah.
And I think the goblin shark.
Yes.
Yes. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to what we're talking about because it is straight out of H.R. Giger's Alien design.
They got like a extending jaw, which is
that's
crazy.
That's great. So, yeah, and pulling those kinds of features from real animals is great because you don't have to. It's going to be grounded when you do that. If you pull, because frankly, nature is going to be much more creative than any single person is. A creature like that is definitely going to be fast. So yeah, very powerful tail. With that, in that case, also you might want to go with the vertical movement. Fish when they move, they wiggle, I guess for lack of a better term, along the horizontal plane, whereas cetaceans, more mammal-like creatures, go along the vertical plane because that's just kind of how the bone structure works out. And so a mermaid or merfolk that goes in the horizontal plane is going to be much more alien and much more predatory. It's going to trigger that thalassophobia in people a little bit more. And one thing that I love to see in monsters from the depths is that sort of lantern eye effect.
Okay.
That the eyes of fish, because they live in dark conditions so much, they have these massive eyes that really reflect the light when it is shown on them, and they look dead and empty and evil. Like the dead eyes of a shark are a real thing, and it's because they don't work like mammal eyes, and we're expecting mammal eyes. And so if you want a monstrous merfolk, that's an excellent way to describe it.
Yeah, that is true. I have another idea for how you could take like kind of those deep sea creatures and sort of turn mermaids on their head. What if instead of like the merfolk, the upper half of the merfolk, the lady part, as it were, being any kind of functional thing, it functions more like an anglerfish's lure.
Oh,
where
this is a mimic.
Yeah, it's just using that sort of lady part to lure the sailors into the water, and then the fish part is what eats them.
That's great, and I have to make a call back to a particular episode of Futurama, which I think does that.
Oh, yeah?
If I recall, because I have a sadly encyclopedic knowledge of these things, I think it is the late Philip J. Fry, in which they feature almost that exact idea. But that's great. Yeah, and nature is really good at that kind of mimicry, because it is sort of an arms race between one species trying to avoid it and one species trying to perfect it. You can see stuff that looks really convincing, even to us who know that, you're looking at a creature that has a thing at the end of a little, like a pole, and it's supposed to look like a worm, and it looks like a worm. That's what they do. Yeah, that's a fantastic idea for some huge anglerfish looking creature that's lurking just below the depths. Ooh, okay. I have an idea that makes that work maybe a little bit better into the system, because it's the idea of why would something be targeting humans so specifically? What if that is a species that's co-evolved with the more traditional mermaids?
Oh yeah, so it's luring mermaids.
Yeah, its primary prey, is merfolk, and so it has what it thinks is a merfolk top, and it just so happens that occasionally they come up to the surface and hit humans as well.
That's excellent.
And when things like that go out of their own context, that's when they become more like horror stories. Like this is something that's acting unnaturally. I like that. That is really cool. I'm going to throw down some anglerfish trivia here, which is that the anglerfish has one of the craziest reproductive cycles of any
I'm familiar, but go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. They have a crazy system where their sexual dimorphism is quite large. The females are huge and the males are quite small. And the males, when they want to mate, they feel a compulsion to bite onto a female. And when they do so, they just stay bitten on, and then their mouths sort of dissolve and fuse with her body. And then they lose all of their motor functions and like their brain and nervous system and everything. And the only thing that's left is like the part that attaches to the female and a little gonad that squirts out sperm. So that when the anglerfish wants to lay some eggs, she squirts out some eggs, and the little male attached to her squirts out some sperm, and they fertilize externally, and then she buggers off because she doesn't care. And it's not 1-to-1 ratio all the time. Sometimes she'll have one female with lots of males all attached to her, which is bonkers. And that's an example where if you throw that at your players or your audience, they're going to go, oh, and you get the satisfaction of knowing that that is a real thing.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, that prompts me to think of other lower halves for the mermaid species, which could be very interesting. The one that I've always loved was Ursula's design. The cephalopod bottom is so good. I kind of wish that was the more dominant version, because it is a design that, like, cephalopods are just cool. They got tentacles. That thing could actually walk on land if it needed to. I've seen octopuses crawl across the deck of a ship, and they're not good at it, but they can do it. And that's creepy as fuck.
Oh, yeah. The octopus tentacles tend to move in a very, like, erratic, like splash out and then pull you towards a certain point, and it's just a very jerky, unnatural movement that would play great into a horror setting. Oh,
absolutely. And in actual cephalopods, at the center of those tentacles is usually the beak, a mouth, and beaks are great. I would love to like if you're going to do a horror scenario where the mermaid, like, this is the mouth up at the head is just for communication. The eating mouth is down below.
Oh God, that's already we're getting some awful mental images.
It's really bad, which I like. And see, the thing is, I didn't plan for us to go horror route. This was supposed to be a nice episode, but that's just where our brains work, I guess.
Yeah.
Would there be, like, the ape version of a mermaid? If this is a species, like we as humans, as a hominid, have, sort of sister species, cousin species, which are close enough in form to us, but are not on our level in terms of, motor functions and stuff. They've diverged in their own ways. So you have gorillas and chimps and lemurs and stuff like that. I think that's always a missed opportunity when we see merfolk in other media, that there aren't sort of like essentially a monkey with.
So you want a Neanderthal coelacanth hybrid?
Yeah, that bangs. I like that idea. That's a rockin' idea. But like, or even just apes. Humans evolved from a common ancestor with apes. It doesn't mean there aren't apes now. So if you go down into an ecosystem where there are merfolk, you might expect to find things that are tangentially related to merfolk and give you some idea of how they, that this was not just one little species that was created by a god or something like that, but that it mimicked a lot of other things. And, oh God, there's a sea monkeys joke in there that I'm just not going to do.
Thank you for that.
And monkeys are great visuals anyway, because they've got they're just funny, and they got the long arms, and you can imagine long webbed fingers and stuff. That's good.
I mean, to sort of touch on that, like, why does it have to be humans and fish? Why not orcs and fish, or any other of your humanoid species in your fantasy world?
That's an excellent question. You absolutely could go any way. In fact, I've seen a lot of mermaid art that depicts them with pointed ears for some reason. I guess because, like, artists just like that, and they.
I mean, that's just your generic way of, this is a fantasy setting.
Exactly.
Look, you can tell the ears are pointed.
Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely, you could pull something like that, and that gives you an opportunity, especially if you're running. I know there's been more interest.
To back up a moment, speaking as an artist, drawing ears is hard. Like, pointed ears are a lot easier to draw than regular human ears. There's lots of weird folds and wrinkles. No one's ears are quite the same.
Well, staying on that subject, pointed ears essentially act as giant arrows that allow you to use those ears in an expressive way, which I can see artists just loving. So that's as completely tangential. I get why people do that. Actually, if you can have them go up and down depending on the mood, it gives your character both an interesting silhouette and a lot of emotional expression, which is very cool. Where were we? We're talking about apes.
Yes.
Okay, so we've talked about sort of the more alien versions of mermaids. If you want to include much more mammalian human versions of an aquatic species like that, I would suggest thinking about them more like cetaceans. Dolphins and whales evolved from essentially a dog-like creature that spent more and more time in the ocean. And you can imagine if a hominid creature started to do the same thing, that it might co-evolve in a lot of the same ways, because the adaptations that cetaceans took on would probably be the same sort of things that our proto-mermaids might take on. And so the legs might fuse together in the same way and turn into a more tail-like appendage with a fin.
But it would keep the advantageous things like opposable fingers.
It seems like opposable fingers would be very useful under the water. So you might get webbed fingers.
Oh, yeah.
You know what? They probably would be bald. As much as
I would think so.
As much as we like having hair on sort of pretty creatures, it makes no sense underwater.
It really doesn't.
So you could have you would see, instead of the scales from the bottom down, probably all over would be that sort of rubbery, leathery, smooth cetacean skin. And that kind of mermaid would almost certainly still have to go to the surface for air of some sort, unless the society has found a way to generate air underneath the water in their underwater cities or whatnot, which would be a good way for them to interact with the humans. If you're going to bring your adventurers or your main character, somebody who is not a mermaid, down into the mermaid world, mermaids that have to deal with getting actual air instead of pulling it from the water means that they're going to have that problem solved. And if they have a solution for it, that solution is probably going to apply to your non-aquatic creatures as well. So that gives you a direct in. And being mammals, they're going to act and think, I think, a bit more like humans, because they will have also be warm-blooded. They'll also give live birth. They'll have milk, all of those things.
I'm thinking these would probably be more of an omnivorous species than carnivorous, like the other species we discussed earlier.
For sure, yeah. If they started off as an omnivorous hominid, then that's probably how they're going to keep up. So they'll not only grab smaller fish or clams, mussels, things like that, but seagrasses and plants and things like that grow under the water, which will mean that they're a lot like humans. And having them be more like humans means they'll be more relatable. The ones that we were talking about before, the anglerfish mermaid, is really not going to be.
No, they're not going to be a friendly interaction.
Yeah, you're not going to have a conversation with that thing, or at least not a relatable conversation.
No.
You might try to convince it not to eat you, but how would living under the water change the way these creatures behave? They're obviously going to have a different sort of communication system than regular humans.
Yeah, it would be difficult to communicate underwater without oxygen.
Exactly. Well, but it's a solved problem. The dolphins and whales do the same sort of thing.
You think they're clicking?
Yeah, clicking, and sort of the whale song that we see. In fact, actually, because sound travels so well underwater, these creatures might be used to conversing with each other over great distances.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you could almost imagine, I hate to use this analogy, but kind of the internet, but for mermaids, where they're listening to the song, which is always going on, and they can join into that song and add their voice, and information might be disseminated that way in almost like a superpower kind of way. Like they would have access to this kind of anywhere.
And if the sound is kind of like something that's not immediately recognizable as speech, like whale song, for instance, it might lead other species to view it as sort of a form of telepathy or other such magical correspondence.
Yeah, you absolutely could throw in some legends about these creatures, reading each other's minds. And on that note, you could totally give them sonar, which would be kind of cool, which gives them an actual superpower. And this way, I mean, pulling from cetaceans in that way, you could. I like the idea that this is the pin that I wanted to put in to it earlier, was the idea that the largest creatures on the earth right now are all whales. And followed up, I think, most closely by either the colossal squids or probably some the great white sharks. So all
right.
yeah, all aquatic creatures, like it's much easier to be big under the ocean,
Oh, yeah.
which means you could have big mermaids.
Giants and mermaids.
I love that idea.
Oh,
The
that's
idea
great.
of you're on your small fishing vessel out in the ocean and you just see an arm come up that reaches up over your mast,
Mhm.
and below your ship, bigger than your entire little fishing boat, is a creature below you, and with intelligent alien eyes that is staring up at you.
Oh, and if you've ever seen like sunken, submerged statues in there, that's a creepy thing to find deep beneath the surface of the water.
Yeah, if you want to trigger some thalassophobia, I think that's a prime real estate.
Oh, absolutely.
And because it works. Like you can grow larger underwater because you don't have to support yourself as much. The structures are just kind of cheaper to grow, as it were, and almost not all of them, but a lot of those species are in fact plankton or krill eaters. They eat the smallest creatures in the world, and so you can imagine that being the same way a particular subspecies of mermaid might go. The idea of having lots of dimorphism amongst the mermaid folk, I think could be really cool. I hate to say it, I watched Aquaman last night, and that was one of the few things that movie got really right, was that like there were a bunch of different kinds of merfolk.
Yeah.
And because especially on a world on a planet like Earth, where 2/3 of the surface is water, you can imagine that there would be as much variety below the waves, probably more, honestly, than there was above. So if you've got elves and orcs and goblins and hobgoblins and all of those things, there shouldn't just be one kind of merfolk down
Oh,
below.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
How does something that was once on land and kind of evolve to live in the water, how do like some of the above ground traditions carry over or translate into underwater?
Well, I had sort of been imagining these were still sort of Australopithecine level of like
Okay.
not tool makers, but if they had come over into the water later and then either been adapted by magic or very, very fast evolution,
Sure, yeah.
then they could have, sort of a cultural memory of having been on the land. That gives them a reverse creation myth in a way.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of the creation myths are about to start with a sort of empty ocean. Something happens to make the land within it. And, creatures come from the foam of the ocean or are crafted from the earth or something like that. And so you start in the water and move to land. Mermaids could have the exact opposite.
Oh, yeah.
Where you start on the land and move into the water. In fact, there's a lot of imagery amongst human myths about rising from lower to higher being sort of the order, the way things get better and brighter, and higher is thought of as better in a lot of ways. Mermaids might be the exact opposite. You could reverse their language and the way they think of the world, where deeper is better.
Interesting.
That their progress has been mostly about going from the shallows to the depths, because when they first entered the ocean, they could only wade out, and then they could live in the shallows. And then as their bodies changed and they could go deeper where it's colder and the pressures are greater, that allowed them to get access to new resources and things like that. So they might think of being on bottom, being beneath, as being better.
That would make sense, I think.
Yeah, that's just a little tonal thing about them. So what do you think like a completely aquatic society might look like? Is there something about the three-dimensionality of their transport that might...
Oh, absolutely. Like when going up and down suddenly becomes as easy as going, side to side, I think verticality becomes a big feature of mermaid homes.
Yeah, there's no reason why you can't have doors and windows and things in all kinds of places. Ooh, you can't build city walls because...
Not in the traditional sense.
Not in the traditional sense. You need to build like a sphere or build a full height wall into an alcove or something like that. So defense is very different in that sense because things could be easily circumvented. That's very interesting. So that gives you an idea of what merfolk architecture might look like. It would be much more... Actually, if you want a good visual reference of it, go look up MC Escher's work, where there is no up or down in a lot of ways, or he plays with the idea of up or down being in different directions simultaneously, and that might be what a foreigner might see when they look at merfolk architecture. That's correct.
I see a lot of twisting and where attention is not paid quite so much to the ups and downs of things.
Hmm.
It's more paid towards the maximization of the use of space.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you seen that either video or GIF of an astronaut who's recently returned to Earth absentmindedly leaving something in the air beside him and then it falling?
Oh yeah, I've seen that.
That's the kind of thinking that the species that lives underwater would also have. It's like
Oh,
you
yeah.
just set something floating in the water like a little bit.
Come back to it later.
Yeah, exactly, and it'll still be there, or maybe it'll drift it off a little bit, but it won't have fallen the way that we might expect it to. That's kind of cool. Also, a society that has great dimorphism, because we were talking about the having lots of different kinds of mermaids, which I really like. You can go two directions with how that might affect the society. Either they're going to be incredibly stratified, and there are going to be lots of little insular in groups where everybody groups by type,
Yeah.
or the opposite can be true, is they're going to be incredibly metropolitan, where it doesn't matter what you look like, merfolk or merfolk, right?
Yeah.
Or I guess if you wanted to have a more living, breathing world, you could be transitioning from one to the other and give your audience, either your players or readers or listeners or whatever, a glimpse at a society in transit from one type, either the less restrictive to the more restrictive, or from more restrictive to less, like in the middle of a revolution. That's something that's been played with a lot, which I like.
Yeah. And with such a high degree of dimorphism, you also end up probably with mermaids that are possibly just physically better at some tasks than others.
Oh, absolutely.
And therein would probably lie, some undersea racism that comes about through such things.
For sure. Yeah, fantasy racism can be fun to play around with, although you do have to worry about,
It not becoming a dog whistle for something.
well, and also we're two white guys.
Yeah, that's
And-
also something to be aware of.
So I do try to be wary of some of that stuff because, man, it can go real bad real quick just because even if you mean well. And so you got to try your best. But I'd be a bit wary about that, especially if it was going out to a public.
Oh, absolutely.
But that being said, I mean, using a slightly obscured metaphor like that to explore an issue, well, all more power to you. I mean, the X-Men did that really great back in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
And then again in the 2000s, but this time instead of racism, it was homophobia. So,
Yeah.
so I have a wild idea I want to pitch you.
Okay.
Mermaidism as a contagion or disease.
Interesting. People as werefish.
I almost said the word were mermaid or weremaid, although that doesn't really work. Merware. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The idea that this is a transition that happens once and then you stay that way rather than changing back and forth. This is almost like by nature a horror idea.
Oh yeah,
but
that's some body horror right there.
I think that could be a really interesting take on it, where it explains a lot of stuff about them biologically, where like they once were a land dwelling creature. They are a normal human if that's what your world is, or maybe they're an elf or an orc or something like that. But that they then are infected in some way or exposed to something that starts changing them, and are then forced to give up their life before and have their body sort of radically changed in a short period of time. That's creepy, man.
Oh yeah, it kind of goes back to that thing you're talking about, the sexual tendencies of anglerfish, where maybe like instead of it being a disease, like you got bit or infested by some other small fish, and this is how it reproduces, is by turning this person into a merfolk creature.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh, yeah, I like that. Merfolk, when they spawn, create these little like bait fish, small little creatures. That this is kind of cool because maybe that's always intended to be aquatic animals. And mermaids, merfolk, are what happen when this goes wrong. There's some species out there that transforms, like maybe let's assume it's meant for tuna or something.
Sure.
And they're meant to grab tuna and inject their DNA into that creature, and it makes some changes. And the tuna, becomes longer and, maybe a bit more intelligent or gets some sort of adaptations. It just changes species a little bit. But ultimately, it started as a fish, and it still is a fish. Versus there's a version where it goes wrong, and it injects its DNA into some sapient land terrestrial creature. And those changes all still happen, but this time it's overwriting your legs so that...
Oh, that's a nightmare.
Yeah. Is it better if they... Better. Is it worse? Which one's worse? Having your legs start to fuse together or them falling off and being replaced?
I think the shock value, the falling off is horrific.
I think it's almost easier to imagine too, like how the physics of it might work. You know, like your legs start to wither, like the muscle all like just withers, like you are emaciated until they just stop getting blood and then fall off, and then a new tail grows in its place. Oh, that's gross. We always go into the grossest places,
Of course.
dude.
We do this for our listeners.
Well, if we like it, then they must like it too, right?
That's the idea.
Otherwise, they wouldn't listen.
Well, they might not know.
Yeah. If you're taking that version of Merfolk, you're going to have an incredibly diverse selection of people who are just sort of ragtag, pulled from anywhere. This isn't a society that's built up. This is a collection of this is a society that adopts people when they come into the ocean lost and alone and like frightened and totally having like PTSD from having been turned into half fish.
Oh yeah.
They pull them into the fold and rebuild them as Merfolk. That's interesting. That's a good way to have Merfolk in a world where you don't want to have them fit into the ecosystem. You don't want to have a big biodiverse society, but instead one where it's like, well, they're out there, but they're a bit dangerous because they might turn you into one of them.
Yeah, because now you've got the society that, it's made for misfits and it needs things. And the only way it can get some of those things is by abducting people from the surface.
Yeah. You could play it up either direction too on what the end result looks like. You could go real monstrous with it, with the bug fish eyes and scales everywhere. Do fish have tongues? Having somebody's tongue fall out?
They do.
Okay.
I know this because I've seen
Oh,
pictures of the fish with its tongue replaced.
by a little. Oh God.
Yeah.
I'm just now my train of thought is completely derailed by
You're welcome.
by how gross that is, and the fact that if you're a merfolk, that might happen to you.
Oh,
What if that little thing is sapient as well and like can talk to you and like voice its own opinions?
oh no, that's horrifying.
Or a comedy duo waiting to happen. That's the perfect way to have a merfolk ventriloquist. Keep your mouth closed while that thing speaks.
Gross.
Yeah, gross. Gross is what we do. Well, I think that's most of my ideas, unless you have something.
I think that about wraps it up for me.
All right. Well, that wraps it for Merfolk then. And, bye.
Signing off.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Monster Mechanics. Additional information and show notes can be found at our website, monsterpod.org. If you'd like to support us, head on over to patreon.com/monsterpod. We'd love to hear your feedback. We can be reached on Twitter at MonsterMPod, or you can email us at monstermechanicspodcast@gmail.com. Monster Mechanics is produced and edited by Scott Paladin. This episode was hosted by Scott Paladin and Zach Jaquays. All of the ideas generated in this episode are released on a do what the fuck you want public license.